Right now, there are roughly 3 million businesses in America that quietly just, keep this entire country functioning.
Yeah, the ones nobody really thinks about.
Exactly. We are talking about like the commercial HVAC fleets, the precision machine shops,
Mm.
regional chemical haulers. And within the next decade, an overwhelming majority of their owners are going to age out and retire.
Which is a huge demographic shift.
Right. But the chilling part is that most of them have absolutely no plan for who takes over. So today, we are looking at this invisible threat that could permanently hollow out the U.S. economy.
And I think the scope of this situation is just, it's really difficult to overstate. When we discuss the silver tsunami, the cultural conversation usually pivots immediately to, I don't know, Medicare, right?
Mm.
Or golf course communities or Social Security solvency.
Yeah, we frame it entirely as this demographic lifestyle shift.
Exactly. But the source material we are looking at today argues that we are completely missing the actual crisis here.
Yeah, so we are doing a deep dive today into a really fascinating article by John F. Hendershot, and it's titled, "The Silver Tsunami is Not What America Thinks It Is."
It's a great piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our mission for this deep dive is to completely reframe how you, listening right now, view the aging out of the baby boomer generation.
Because it's not just about retirement.
Right. According to this text, it's not just about real estate or pensions. It is a creeping structural threat to the entire industrial foundation of the country. Okay, let's unpack this because um, the sheer scale of the numbers presented here really forces you to look at the economy in a totally different way.
Yeah, and those numbers are the perfect starting point. The text outlines that baby boomers currently own between 2.3 and 3 million privately held businesses in the United States.
3 million. That's just wild.
Right. And to put the gravity of that into perspective, those companies employ more than 32 million people. They generate trillions of dollars in annual economic activity. Yeah, so we are not talking about, small weekend hobby shops here.
Yeah.
We are talking about the core infrastructure that sustains local economies across the board.
I like to think of the American economy like a car.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah. So as a society, we are just completely obsessed with the dashboard. The dashboard is shiny. It's the S&P 500. It's Fortune 500 public companies.
Quarterly earnings reports from the massive tech giants.
Exactly. We stare at the dashboard all day long, constantly analyzing it, but we entirely ignore the hidden machinery under the hood that actually makes the car move.
And the author explicitly points out that America's economy doesn't function simply because of those quarterly earnings reports.
Right.
It functions because millions of these smaller, highly specialized operators are solving incredibly complex physical problems every single day.
Yeah, the text lists these highly specific, honestly deeply unglamorous businesses,
Mm.
machine shops, electrical contractors, underground utility companies, tool and die operations.
The essential stuff.
Exactly. Regional distributors. These are the businesses you never, ever think about until the absolute moment the service stops. But unlike the massive corporations on the dashboard, these small operators share a unique and honestly fatal vulnerability.
What's fascinating here is why these specific businesses are so fragile right now. Because if you look at a massive public corporation, they have, deep executive benches, they have human resources departments, and totally institutionalized succession planning.
Right. If a CEO retires, the board just immediately slots the next executive in.
Exactly. But these 2.3 to 3 million privately held businesses, they do not have succession departments. They are heavily and sometimes entirely owner dependent.
So the operational knowledge isn't sitting in some manual or a corporate wiki. It's siloed entirely inside the owner's head,
Yeah, the vendor relationships, the customer trust, the deeply specialized technical processes, I mean, they exist solely as experience accumulated slowly over like 40 years.
which is terrifying when you
Yeah.
think about it.
It really is. And beyond just the lack of documentation, there is a profound psychological barrier at play here, too. For a founder who has run a commercial fabrication company for 4 decades, that business is their entire identity.
Yeah, facing succession means kind of facing their own obsolescence.
Exactly. So they simply avoid the topic, they put off the paperwork, they don't bother to train a number two, and they just wait far too long to figure out who actually takes over.
I want you, listening to this right now, to just pause and think about the everyday services your town relies on.
Yeah, the local heroes.
Right, like the commercial refrigeration company that keeps the local food processing plant running, or the specialized waste hauler in your county. Just consider how many of those critical nodes are quietly single-point vulnerabilities,
Dependent on one person.
totally dependent on one 72-year-old owner who hasn't figured out how to hand over the keys.
And when enough of these owners fail to transition successfully, it stops being a private family problem. It morphs into a full-on macroeconomic crisis.
Which is what the author really drills into.
Right. The text is very careful to differentiate what happens next from a normal economic downturn because the mechanics of this crisis are completely different from a standard recession.
Okay, let's dig into that because we've all lived through recessions. The basic formula is that people lose jobs, credit gets tight, and businesses slow down. So how is this silver tsunami fundamentally different from the recessions we are used to?
Well, a traditional recession is primarily a demand shock. Consumers get nervous, so they slow their spending down.
Right, they pull back.
And in response, businesses temporarily reduce their production. They might initiate layoffs or idle some machines. But the crucial distinction is that the productive infrastructure itself remains intact.
The factory is still physically there.
Exactly. It's just waiting for consumer demand to recover. The silver tsunami, however, is a structural supply-side threat.
Meaning the factory doesn't just idle. It gets completely dismantled and sold for parts.
Right. The productive engine permanently disappears. There is an enormous difference between a temporary slowdown at a precision machine shop and that same machine shop shutting its doors forever.
Auctioning off the equipment.
Yeah, auctioning off its specialized equipment, scattering its workforce, all because the aging owner couldn't find a buyer. When that happens, the local economy loses decades of operational refinement that is extraordinarily difficult to replace.
Now wait, hold on. That actually doesn't make sense to me.
How so?
Usually, if a bunch of businesses close and people lose jobs, spending dries up. And when nobody's spending, prices drop.
So how is the author possibly arguing that these businesses closing is going to cause a massive spike in inflation?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
That's because we have been totally conditioned to view recessions purely through the lens of consumer demand.
Okay.
The phenomenon described in the text is cost-push inflation, and it is driven entirely by supply destruction.
Supply destruction, right. So imagine a region loses 20% of its industrial contractors or regional trucking firms simply because the owners retired and liquidated.
But the demand for those trucks or contractors hasn't changed at all. But the physical capacity to do the work has suddenly evaporated.
Exactly. The surviving firms cannot instantly absorb all that leftover capacity. That creates severe, immediate local shortages. And when shortages occur, the surviving companies suddenly gain immense pricing power.
Oh, wow. Because they're the only game in town.
Right, they can double their rates because the client literally has no other alternative.
And furthermore, larger corporations that used to rely on those local suppliers are now forced to source materials or services from much farther away.
Which instantly increases logistics costs.
Right. Procurement costs, transportation time, everything goes up.
Yeah, lead times stretch out, operational bottlenecks start to spread, and every single one of those rising costs ripples through the supply chain until it gets passed directly to the consumer.
So prices are surging, not because the economy is booming, but because the underlying machinery is physically breaking down.
And when you have surging inflation occurring alongside a shrinking productive capacity, you enter incredibly dangerous macroeconomic territory known as stagflation.
Slower growth, higher prices.
Exactly. And the insidious thing about stagflation is that traditional monetary policy is largely ineffective against it. The Federal Reserve can raise interest rates to cool consumer demand, sure, but raising interest rates does not magically build a new specialized machine shop.
No, you cannot instantly recreate specialized certifications or vendor trust and technical operating knowledge just by tweaking a federal interest rate.
It just doesn't work that way.
But this supply destruction doesn't just isolate itself to the trucking industry or the machine shops, right? The moment that specialized hauler goes under, it creates an immediate financial shockwave that hits the one institution holding the bag for all of them, which is the regional community bank.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the banking system is a massive blind spot for most people analyzing these demographic shifts, particularly the community and regional banks.
I was thinking about this, and it's not really some dramatic game of Jenga. It's more like pulling a critical specialized gear out of a heavy-duty transmission.
That's a great way to put it.
The rest of the gears might still be in perfect shape, but without that specific connecting piece, the entire engine seizes up. These local institutions are just fundamentally tied to small and mid-sized commercial borrowers.
Well, think about what a regional community bank actually holds on its balance sheet.
Right, it's not all just personal checking accounts.
No, they hold the heavy equipment loans for the retiring machinist. They hold the commercial real estate mortgages for the warehouses. They provide the operating lines of credit, the SBA financing, the fleet financing for the local logistics providers.
So when an owner just locks the doors and walks away, instead of selling the business cleanly, the bank takes a direct hit.
A massive hit.
Commercial vacancies suddenly rise, and the local deposits from that business vanish basically overnight.
And then the value of the collateral backing those loans weakens drastically, causing the loan portfolios to deteriorate. And banks absolutely despise uncertainty.
Naturally.
Once they experience this kind of asset deterioration, they react by aggressively tightening their credit standards. It becomes exponentially harder for anyone else in town to get a commercial loan.
Which triggers that vicious cycle the author warns about.
Exactly.
The closures create tighter lending. But tighter lending means the next generation of young entrepreneurs faces even greater difficulty getting the capital they actually need to acquire the businesses that are trying to sell.
It's a trap.
Yeah, so reduced acquisitions create even more closures, which creates even tighter credit. It just feeds on itself.
And the text points out that this collapse bleeds into the foundation of the whole town. The local machine shop closes, which hits the local bank, which causes the commercial landlord to default. Consequently, municipal tax revenue just plummets.
The very tax revenue that supports the local infrastructure, the fire departments, the public schools, I mean, everything touches everything.
It really does.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because we've spent a lot of time on the macroeconomic level, inflation, supply chains, banking systems. We need to look at the human cost.
Yeah, the personal side.
Right. Because for a listener thinking, well, if the owner retires and can't find a buyer, can't they just sell off their trucks and equipment and retire comfortably on that cash?
That's a fair question.
Why is liquidation described in the text as being so uniquely devastating compared to selling the business as a going concern?
Well, it requires understanding where the actual value of a business lives. Because for millions of these owners, the business is their retirement account.
It's not like they have a massive 401k just sitting there.
Right. It's not a diversified stock portfolio. They reinvested their profits back into the company for decades, basically assuming it would eventually be a major liquidity event that funded their retirement and created generational wealth for their family.
But a liquidation auction is not a liquidity event. It's a fire sale.
Completely. When you sell a healthy, functioning business, what they call a going concern, you are selling future cash flow. You are selling goodwill, brand equity, customer continuity, and an intact, trained workforce.
All the stuff you can't touch.
Exactly. All of that intangible architecture carries immense premium value. But when you liquidate after an operational collapse, you preserve absolutely none of that.
You're just selling used metal at that point.
Literally.
The equipment gets auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to someone a state away.
Yeah.
Decades of built-up relationships and brand equity just vanish into thin air.
And the author suggests that at scale, this failure to transition represents one of the largest quiet destructions of generational entrepreneurial wealth in modern American history.
Wow. That is just heartbreaking for the owner who built it.
Yeah.
But what about the workforce?
Oh, yeah.
Because the text brings up a highly concerning point about the labor market,
Mhm.
specifically around specialized, localized labor that gets completely scattered during these liquidations.
This introduces a crucial economic concept called hysteresis.
Hysteresis.
Yeah. Hysteresis is a phenomenon where temporary unemployment gradually mutates into permanent structural unemployment.
I was thinking about this, and it's kind of like trying to plug a 1990s floppy disk into a modern MacBook.
That's a good analogy.
The data, the skill, is still perfectly good, but the required hardware interface has entirely moved on. The worker hasn't changed. The economy's operating system did.
The friction in that mismatch is exactly what causes the long-term damage. So imagine a 58-year-old machinist. He has spent 30 years working inside a regional fabrication company, mastering a highly specialized, perhaps slightly older operational environment.
Right.
When that owner retires and the shop liquidates, that 58-year-old loses his job.
And he can't just walk across the street to some massive, highly automated multinational aerospace plant and do the exact same job.
No, his skills are hyper-specific to that one shop's legacy equipment.
His specialized local knowledge is basically no longer applicable to the broader corporate market.
Right, so his temporary layoff becomes permanent structural unemployment. And the cascading regional consequences of that are brutal. You see lower regional productivity, you see slower wage growth, and drastically declining economic mobility.
And then young workers observe this decline, they realize there is no upward trajectory in their hometown, and they leave the area entirely.
Which just causes a brain drain that accelerates the demographic collapse even further.
But here is the thing that really chills me about this whole source text. If this is so devastating, I mean, if it's causing stagflation, destabilizing regional banks, wiping out generational wealth, and permanently displacing specialized workers,
Yeah.
why aren't there alarm bells going off everywhere? Like, why isn't this the lead story on financial news networks?
Because of the highly insidious way it unfolds.
Yeah.
The text emphasizes that the most dangerous characteristic of the silver tsunami is its invisibility.
Right, there is no dramatic cinematic collapse.
It's not the 2008 financial crisis where Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt over a single weekend and the global stock market instantly crashes.
There is no flashing red headline.
None. It is just thousands of businesses quietly disappearing month after month, year after year. A retiring commercial contractor over here, a regional supplier quietly liquidating over there.
Individually, if you live in that town, it just feels like one isolated natural closure. Like, old Bob finally decided to shut down the shop.
Exactly. Good for Bob, right?
Right.
But collectively, when you aggregate thousands of old Bobs across the Midwest or the Sun Belt,
It's a completely different story.
collectively, it is a devastating economic erosion. Entire regions begin to feel weaker, they feel poorer and more fragile without fully understanding why.
Because there is less local capital circulating, fewer stable employers.
And a growing, desperate dependence on giant outside corporations to provide basic jobs. As the author notes, the danger isn't simply an economic contraction. The danger is a permanent hollowing out.
A permanent hollowing out.
Yeah. And we have historical precedent for this. If you look at the Rust Belt in the late 20th century, the hollowing out didn't happen overnight. It happened factory by factory, supplier by supplier, until the entire ecosystem basically collapsed.
That is just a terrifying prospect. But, the text doesn't just leave us in the dark with this impending doom.
Thankfully, no.
The author asserts that America still has time to mitigate this. Not unlimited time, obviously, but a closing window.
Right.
This raises an important question. If these businesses are still viable and they still have customers and are fundamentally profitable, what can communities actually do to stop this slow motion collapse?
Well, the crucial realization is that the core business model is not the problem. The businesses make money. The problem is strictly the absence of transition readiness.
Okay, so it's not about the product.
Not at all. It is the lack of management continuity, it's the missing operational documentation, and the absence of investor-grade financials that a bank would require to underwrite a loan for a new, younger buyer.
So the author's primary call to action is basically a massive cultural and civic mindset shift. We have to stop treating business succession planning as this purely private conversation that happens behind closed doors around a family dinner table.
The text calls it economic infrastructure preservation. Communities that want to survive this demographic wave need to actively build what the author calls transition ecosystems around their local businesses.
They cannot just passively wait for owners to figure it out.
Exactly.
So what does a transition ecosystem actually look like in practice? Because it has to be more than just, a local chamber of commerce hosting a seminar.
Oh, absolutely. It requires coordinated municipal intervention. It means local governments creating registries of aging business owners and actively reaching out to them.
Getting ahead of it.
Yes. It means providing municipal grants for transition audits to help owners get their messy accounting into investor-grade shape.
Which is huge.
It is. It means matching ambitious trade school graduates or young professionals with retiring founders for formal apprenticeship and buyout tracks.
So it's really about building the financial and legal plumbing so that when an owner is ready to step down, there is a clear supported pipeline to transition that asset to the next generation rather than just letting it go to the auction block.
Precisely.
Because the communities that ignore this will just slowly watch their foundation crumble, basically one quiet retirement party at a time.
And by the time they realize what's missing, the capital and the skills are just gone forever.
Okay, let's take a breath because we have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by completely redefining the silver tsunami. It is not a story about golf courses and demographic lifestyle shifts. It is a vital economic continuity story.
Absolutely.
We looked under the hood at the nearly 3 million privately held businesses that make the American economy actually run. We saw how their quiet disappearance doesn't just cause a standard recession, but triggers supply destruction and that nightmare scenario of stagflation.
Right.
We looked at the transmission gear mechanics of how local community banks and municipal tax bases are fundamentally threatened.
Mm.
And we explored the devastating human cost. The liquidation of generational wealth and the structural hysteresis of specialized labor.
A lot to process.
It is. So what does this all mean? How do we take this massive, invisible macroeconomic threat and turn it into something actionable for you, the listener, and for the future?
Well, if we look closely at the author's call for communities to build these transition ecosystems, it leads to a truly fascinating alternative to how modern cities operate today.
Okay.
Think about modern economic development. We constantly see local and state governments offering massive tax breaks and literally billions of dollars in public subsidies just to lure giant multinational tech plants or mega warehouses to their town.
Well, yeah. Municipalities fight bitter public battles over who gets to host the next big corporate headquarters, hoping it will bring jobs.
Right. But what if we flip that model entirely?
What do you mean?
What if, instead of courting massive outside corporations who frankly have zero loyalty to the region, cities use those massive financial war chests to fund, train, and subsidize young locals to buy out the retiring boomer business owners right in their own backyards?
Oh, wow.
Imagine a city redirecting its economic development budget to provide the equity for a 30-something local entrepreneur to buy the retiring electrical contractor's business.
That makes so much sense.
You preserve the local jobs, you keep the profits circulating locally rather than being siphoned off to Wall Street, and you maintain the crucial productive infrastructure that already exists. It's just an entirely different, incredibly resilient way to think about investing in a community's future.
That is a brilliant thought to leave on. Instead of spending billions trying to build a shiny new dashboard from scratch to impress outsiders, communities really should invest in the people who can keep the hidden machinery under the hood running smoothly for the next 40 years.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you drive through your town, take a second look at the unassuming machine shops, the commercial HVAC fleets, and the regional distributors.
They're holding it all together.
They really are. They might not make the glamorous headlines, but they are the transmission gears holding the entire local economy together. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.